Okay, class. Now let's pick up with part 2 and try to understand the the more micro perspective of which employees end up leaving and why. So first, what we know is that new employees are generally more likely to leave. So employees who have been in the firm for 6 months or fewer, more likely to leave. Next are those who have been there 1 to 2 years. Now, why do you think that's the case, class? Some of these answers will become clear as we proceed further into the lecture. And now, what else predicts turnover? Now, the answers that I usually hear when I deliver this lecture live in class is job satisfaction. Yeah, people who are dissatisfied leave, and that's a fairly reasonable assumption. But what we find, class, interestingly, is that the morale or job satisfaction, these models based on that, predict only 25% of variance in turnover. So who leaves and who doesn't leave is only 25% explained by job satisfaction. It is a fairly complex thing, class, yeah? So the relationship between job satisfaction and turnover is smaller than people assume. And some of the reasons for this will be clear as we proceed. Here we have a nice chart of predictors of turnover from the strongest to the weakest, with the strongest being thoughts of quitting, naturally, and relationship with supervisor very high up, yeah? People who've been in the job longer, have high tenure, are less likely to leave. Job satisfaction is certainly a strong predictor, but not the top necessarily, yeah, and so on and so forth. You can look through this in your own time in the slides. So to understand who is likely to leave, we should start with what are the types of turnover, yeah? So let's start at the top of the diagram. Turnover can be divided into voluntary and involuntary turnover, which basically gets at, did the employee leave of their own volition, or were they forced out? So starting with involuntary turnover, we have people who were made to leave the organization. They were discharged, perhaps because of discipline issues or poor performance, or they were let go in a downsizing process. Yeah? So it could be layoffs, redundancies, site closings, etc. Yeah? So these are involuntary turnover, and these are fairly complex change management type issues, especially on the downsizing side, tends to be complex and change management centered. Tends to be a fairly big to-do, which we won't talk about in today's lecture. Moving next to voluntary turnover, these are when employees choose to leave. They quit. And this can be functional turnover, which is when poor-fitting employees choose to leave the firm. Yeah. And so this is turnover that is good. This is when people who don't fit decide to depart. And this can happen, this can have a range of benefits. So one is that the replacement worker may be more productive and a better citizen, so they may contribute more to the organization. It provides an opportunities to bring in new KSAs and a motivational injection from the outside. It creates an opportunity to potentially restructure the work unit or create savings if you decide not to replace this counterproductive employee who left. It could create promotion opportunities for others and could maybe entail replacement at lower costs. So functional turnover creates opportunities more than it creates downsides, yeah? However, what we're really concerned about here is dysfunctional turnover. This is when your best employees, your star performers, leave the firm. Now, class, dysfunctional turnover, we can divide again into avoidable dysfunctional turnover, which could be prevented, and unavoidable, which could not be prevented. And again, harking back to that statistic from part 1, fraction of employees who are leaving can be retained. There is a lot of avoidable dysfunctional turnover. So, once again, we have types of turnover here. Let's start with unavoidable, the turnover that we cannot prevent. So, with these employees, we can't really do much of anything. Yeah, these are people who leave because they are retiring or are starting a new career. They're encountering health issues. Could be because of childcare or migration. Yeah, so heaps of possible reasons for unavoidable turnover. Then there is avoidable turnover. Yeah, And avoidable turnover can be keeping employees who are high performers, who have strong KSAOs, they have intellectual capital that is valued by the organization, and have high promotion potential, and are difficult to replace. Those who are low value, who do not perform well, lack the KSAOs, easy to replace, don't really need to prevent them from leaving. And so our focus is, how do we keep these people? These are the ones that we can actually act on to retain. Now, to understand this process better, Lee and Mitchell put forth the unfolding model, which I think is still one of the most insightful models of turnover and retention. So they argue, class, that employees don't just randomly go, oh, you know what, it's time to leave, unless there is a situation that prompts them to rethink their position. And the unfolding model calls these situations shocks. So it really is a model about shocks. Shocks are events that force the employee to reevaluate their job. Yeah, now these shocks can be negative events, like being laid off, or that of course is a very serious shock. But there are also positive events, like promotions and bonuses can actually prompt a change. And so in the unfolding model, there are 4 general paths that people take when they leave. Path 1 is there's a shock and people follow a plan that's in place for leaving. This tends to be very rare. Path 2, I should say, is that there's a shock and people suddenly go, oh, you know what, I think I do need to leave, and they leave even without formulating a plan for where they're going to go next necessarily. Path 3 is leaving for something better. There's a shock that is relatively mild and makes people dissatisfied, and so they start thinking, oh, I think I should leave. And this tends to transpire over a much longer time span. And then the 4th path is that the job just doesn't make them happy, and they are unhappy for such a long time that they finally start either looking for alternatives and try to leave, or they just quit. Like, it's just more than they can bear. So, let's talk about shocks. There are generally 2 kinds of shocks. There are shocks that are work-related and shocks that are personal. So, again, shocks are these unforeseen events that force a person to rethink their current circumstances. So we have negative personal shocks, can be a divorce, looking after an ill family member. Positive personal shocks can be receiving an inheritance, or spouse gets a promotion and must then move. Yeah, so these can all prompt a job change. These can all prompt employees to leave. Albeit for different reasons, positive and negative reasons, but it doesn't really matter. They're still going to leave. Yeah, some of these are unforeseen, I should say, like getting a promotion and so on. And others might be maybe more expected, maybe even planned for. And then there can be work-related shocks. So these can be like unsolicited job offers, and on the negative side, it could be a merger and acquisition, conflict with a supervisor. Yeah, so these shocks can also push employees out. So basically, when these events occur that force the employee to rethink their circumstances, it can lead to turnover. Yeah, so all of these things can cause turnover. So generally, people initially thought about leaving in response to a shock. It didn't matter if the shock was positive, negative, or neutral, or expected or unexpected. It still prompted them to rethink their situation. Yeah, and surprisingly, many people left their jobs even without having an alternative job lined up. Fairly common thing, as we'll see in the results. So here we have the unfolding model. Yeah, we have the 4 paths I mentioned earlier, including 4A and 4B, which is just leaving without having an alternative, and here 4B is you're leaving for something better. And what starts is what prompts them to leave. For paths 1, 2, and 3, it really is a shock. There's a shock that happens and they decide to leave. For those who take path 4, there isn't so much a shock as they just really hate their jobs, and it kind of stews for a long time, and then they finally leave in some way. And you'll notice here the time span. that those who leave unprompted, without a shock, it takes them a while to do it. So even those who are dissatisfied take forever to leave. Even if they leave without a plan and just like, I'm just gonna quit my job and move on, like, it still takes quite a bit of time. And even longer if you look for another alternative job to jump to. So once again, following the unfolding, we have shocks and we have just gradual dissatisfaction. And then from those, among all of these, only those in path 1 have a plan. They know what they're going to do when they leave and they have an alternative in mind. This is again the rarest path. Yeah, and you can't really do much about this. There's a shock, they have a plan, they leave, you can't really retain them. Yeah? Then, are these people dissatisfied? Path 1? No, not really. This was their plan all along. They knew they were gonna leave. Those in the other paths are somewhat unhappy. Yeah, which is why the shock also leads to a negative evaluation of, oh, it's time to go. Do they look for alternative jobs? Path 2? No, they don't. So in path 2, they have a shock, they don't have a plan, they know they're unhappy, and they just leave. They leave without having an alternative in mind. Yeah? Those in path 3, they have a shock. They don't have a plan, they know they're unhappy, and they start looking for alternative jobs. And so that's why it actually takes people in path 3 the longest. And so if you're looking for people to retain, it's those in paths 3 to 4. Generally, these are the people who are retainable. So, in this classic paper, Mitchell, Holtom, and Lee tested the unfolding model. Yeah, so they used questionnaires and interviews and found that they could classify 95% of job leavers, people who left their jobs, into one of the 4 paths. Yeah, with paths 3 and 4B being the most frequent. So once again, we have people who encounter a shock. They don't have a plan, they know they're unhappy, and they start looking for another job they can move to. And 4B, there's no shock, they just really hate their jobs, they know they're unhappy, and they look for another job to move to. And it takes a long time to do these things. And over 60% of job departure was triggered by a shock. Yeah, so shocks explain a lot of departure, and over 50% left because of a shock outside of the organization. So this is another thing to consider. Yeah, like why job satisfaction doesn't necessarily predict turnover is that over half left because of personal shocks that were beyond the control of the organization. Granted, they may have been somewhat unhappy, which may make the departure easy to do, yeah, in some instances. But by and large, a lot of turnover happens because of personal shocks. And that's just the nature of things, yeah? And so you work on what you can, and it really is the people who are in paths 3 and 4B, yeah? Those who encounter shocks and then slowly, gradually leave, and those who are dissatisfied and gradually plan to exit. So, based on the unfolding model, we can learn a few things. So, this is where exit interviews can be very helpful. When people leave, try to work out what is the shock, if any, that prompted them to leave. Yeah? So, what are the shocks that led to people leaving? And ask yourself, could some of these shocks be reduced by using realistic job previews? Yeah, give job candidates a realistic view of the job in the recruitment process. For example, a merger or a big change management scheme, yeah, is a shock as well. And so preparing people for it can make a difference. If there are unsolicited job offers, yeah, then you need to deal directly with that and be prepared to negotiate with the employee to keep them. Yeah, that this is another problem many organizations have, is being unable and unwilling to negotiate to keep employees. Often because they're too bureaucratic and too stodgy that way. And importantly, if there are external shocks, it's important to help employees deal with them, because that can ultimately help keep the employee. If you help them manage the external shock, be open to, say, a work from home scheme if the employee is looking after a very ill family member, for example. Now, there are other factors that predict turnover. that have nothing to do with the job necessarily and have to do with the person. Some people are just more likely to quit regardless, yeah? So what we know is that people who are high in agreeableness and conscientiousness are generally likely to stick to their jobs regardless, yeah? Of course, they will still encounter shocks, and they will still be unhappy if that happens, but by and large, these people are less likely to quit. Emotional stability greater predicts intention to neuroticism, yeah? So emotional stability is the opposite of neuroticism, so people with high neuroticism are more likely to depart. Okay, now let's talk about what makes people stay. So-called job embeddedness. How do we embed people in organizations and get them to stick around? There are 3 factors to consider. First is links. People stay in their jobs if they have strong relationships with others, yeah? And they stay if they have had to sacrifice, if leaving the job would involve making a big sacrifice or losing some nice benefits. And fit, because they fit the job well, they'd be more likely to stay. And this is one of the few times, class, where fit is beneficial. So I am not a fan of culture fit. I think culture fit is often used as an excuse for a lot of bullshit organizational practices. Fit doesn't matter as much as people think. But here, when it comes to keeping people on the job, fit does make a difference. However, it's only one of 3 factors, class. So, why do people stay? They stay if they fit, they stay if they have good relationships, and they stay if leaving would involve giving up some nice things, yeah? And we can look at these aspects of job embeddedness across 2 different loci, 2 different domains, we might call them. So there's on the job, which is I fit well with the job, I have good relationships, in my current job, and leaving my job would be hard and would involve some sacrifice. And then there's off the job embeddedness or community embeddedness. So, this is people liking where they live, yeah? Because if people don't like where they live, that can also prompt departure. Yeah? So this is, for example, in Perth, saying, oh, I really fit with Perth culture, and I have good friends in Perth, and leaving Perth would involve a big sacrifice and giving up some nice things or giving up the stability of my life in Perth. Yeah? So both of these are important for keeping people staying. Yeah? This embeddedness on the job and embeddedness in the community. So, let's go through this. Fit class is the worker being compatible. Part of that is having the right KSAOs, but another big part is fitting with the organizational culture. Yeah, so employees who are compatible are more likely to stay. And then here we have off the job fitting in the community, being comfortable. Yeah, the location suits the worker's lifestyle. Yeah, Perth is not for everybody. There may be many of you who are keen to leave Perth and move over east because that sort of lifestyle appeals to you more. And in that case, you would have low off the job embeddedness, specifically with fit. Yeah, and of course there are family considerations. So if you've got a kid or a kid on the way, or you're planning for kids, you will want to move somewhere that is kid friendly. Yeah, that sort of thing. Then we have links class. So for links, we have strong connections and relationships with colleagues, within the team, with mentors and friends in the organization. So this is why referral recruitment schemes are also powerful retention strategies, because by hiring a person who is referred, they already have a link in the organization to start with. Yeah, so that can be quite beneficial. On the other hand, for off-the-job links, there's the importance of having friends and relatives in the area. This is where your partner lives as well, or maybe you have a church or community group that you're closely connected to. And so having these connections can also keep employees around. Lastly, sacrifices. So this is where if I were to leave the organization, I would be giving up important benefits and inducements. So like a great benefit scheme, giving up the org culture, or a promotion opportunity. Yeah. Off the job, this is if I were to leave Perth, I would be giving up some important benefits, like my status in the Perth community, for example. Or giving up the advantages of the relatively low cost of living, maybe. Yeah. Probably not the case in Sydney, but maybe elsewhere. And home ownership. Maybe you already own a home in Perth and don't want to go through the rigmarole of selling your home and moving elsewhere. Yeah, so this can also keep people around. Granted, you may be off the job or community embedded and may find another job in your community, but the way the labor market works in the 2020s is that it's just not likely, right? That it can be harder to find relevant jobs if you have location limitations, and so that can create complications and can leave people maybe trapped in a job that they would rather leave, for example. Yeah. So how can we maximize these things to keep employees in the organization? How do we build links? First is providing mentors. So a formal mentorship scheme can help build links that keep people. Recognizing team accomplishments, to reinforce the strength and the identity of the team. For links in the community, community service opportunities can actually build these community links that keep people around. Yeah, and sponsoring employee sports teams and local leagues, like small things that embed the employees in the community, will keep them from departing. Then we have here fit. So how do we increase this compatibility? Yeah, it can be hiring based on person job fit, and this I somewhat disagree with. Hiring based on person organization fit, this matters less ultimately for high performers, but it does improve retention. Then for fit in the community, you can recruit intensively among locals. So when you hire locals, people in your area, they're more likely to stay because they're already community embedded. Yeah, family-friendly HR practices and work-life balance practices also give people this like chance to embed themselves in the community and to fit better that way. Then we have sacrifices. What do people give up if they quit? In the organization, some of the things you can do is provide financial incentives to stay or non-financial incentives. So basically, just if the job is of high quality, people are more likely to stay because they don't want to leave and give up the perks. On the other hand, on the community side, assisting with housing can also help people create this sacrifice if they were to leave the community. So many organizations provide housing assistance in some form if it's housing within the community, and that's a good thing to do because it helps keep these people around. Yeah. So generally, when developing a retention strategy, you want to start with who is quitting. So you need exit interviews. Yeah. Then, so doing this will identify who are you losing. You will gain data about those who are leaving across various categories like department and job group. Then you set some retention goals. Do we need to retain more people, first of all? And how is our retention aligning up with industry benchmarks? Then those who stay, ask them why they stay. What makes them embedded? And then develop goals to help those who might be quitting, those who specifically you would want to retain. How do we embed these people? Then you have strategies for the whole organization that are blanket strategies, that focus on adjusting the overall retention rate, typically lowering it, based on recruitment methods or HR processes. On the other hand, you have focused strategies that are aimed at specific departments, if that department is really problematic. So here you would really be relying on exit interviews. Admittedly, exit interviews can be somewhat unreliable, so you can also get consultants to come in who are outsiders to do the exit interviews or to speak to people who've left the organization. Lots of things that you can do to improve the quality of exit interview data. Yeah, so you can come up with a focused strategy for specific departments. And lastly, this will hopefully inform your retention policy. And once again, this is only a cause for concern if it's high performers that are leaving, yeah, or lots of average performers. We know that morale matters, not completely, but it matters some. And so it's helpful to work out what the shocks are and the role that morale and job satisfaction plays. Yeah? And of course, gender differences will be critical. And if there are job alternatives, if you know what people are leaving for, you'll want to engage with those alternatives head on. So, like I said before, work out who is quitting, set retention goals, and then work out a retention strategy. Some overall suggestions. First is you will want exit interviews, but don't just rely on exit interview data. These can be somewhat, people are not always honest about why they're leaving. It will take some probing to get accurate information. You'll want to look at each subgroup, for example, demographic subgroups, and work out their reasons for leaving. These may vary meaningfully. You'll want to target high performers in your retention strategy. So once again, we want to lower dysfunctional turnover. And then for those who stay, figure out why they stay. What keeps them embedded in the organization and or community? Yeah, you'll want to benchmark your retention rates with industry standards. Realistic job previews can also help with retention. Yeah, if people know what they're getting into, they'd be more likely to stay and less likely to view their start in the organization as a shock in some form. And of course, working with managers to deal with the job satisfaction issues prompted by bad managers, for example. And generally, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. There are things you can do at a blanket organization level, but you really have to adjust it to the employee, the industry, the issues that you're confronting. What are the shocks and what are the things that dissatisfy them? And ultimately tailor the retention strategy to suit the organization's circumstances. Maybe the retention level is just right. Maybe it's too high, too low. And there we go, class. That's all I have for you on retention. See you again next week.